Okay, this long podcast is to help all my Year 11s with preparation for their Unit 1 International Relations exam on the Cold War. By the end of this hour, I would have run through all the content, by and large, that you would need to get the top grade, A star, and I will try to pepper the content with the typical exam structure technique that you would need to answer the questions appropriately to get the top grade, because that's what you're all gunning for. So, the Cold War, what was it? The Cold War was a 45-year standoff between the two superpowers that were victorious at the end of the Second World War, characterised by an arms race, a war of words, proxy wars, and the threat of mutually assured destruction on either side. Throw in there the space race, throw in there regional conflict, Berlin Walls, and pretty much that is what the Cold War was all about. It ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it began in the years coming up to the end of and straight after the Second World War. So, what do we need to understand? Well, firstly, why did the Cold War begin? To understand that, you need to understand that it was a history of mistrust already between the two great superpowers. When the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, the USA sent soldiers to fight on the side of the whites against the reds, and the USSR never forgot that. Likewise, there was a very strong anti-communist feeling within the USA at the end of the First World War and into the 1920s and 30s. And we get organisations such as the American League, an organisation of American volunteers whose primary aim was to eradicate Bolshevism in any form in the USA. So, what do we see happening during the Second World War? Firstly, Nazi Germany declares war on the USA and the USSR in 1941. So what we have is that these two sides are on the same side fighting Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan by the end of the war. So what that means is that these two sides that initially mistrusted each other are now having to find themselves in some kind of uneasy alliance to fight the more pressing evil, that of Hitler and the Germans. The first time that the great leaders of the two superpowers meet is in Tehran in September 1943. And so, what do we need to know about the Tehran Conference? Well, the Tehran Conference, I say September, it's actually November 1943. You might see me looking over to the book every now and again because I understand the history and I've got a good awareness of what happened, but sometimes the dates escape me. So, I am a good teacher, honestly. So what we see at Tehran, which is in Iran, in the Middle East, is the meeting of the big three. Joseph Stalin of the USSR, Franklin Roosevelt of the USA, and Winston Churchill of Great Britain, who was the other main contributor fighting the Nazis at that time. What did they agree on at this conference? Well, firstly, they agreed that Germany is the greatest threat to the world and that they would be defeated first, and they demanded unconditional surrender of the Germans, which meant that there'd be no negotiations, you'll surrender. Secondly, the Allies, that is America and Britain, firmly committed themselves to opening a second front against the Germans as soon as possible, because in 1943 it was the Soviet Red Army that was fighting the bulk of the German army in Eastern Europe and in Russia. What else do you need to know about the Tehran Conference? There was a general agreement that after the war was won, which was no way a certain thing in 1943, that there would be a creation of United Nations, and that Stalin in 1943 agreed to some form of free elections in Eastern Europe, specifically in Poland. This conference is held as a general success. The mood was quite optimistic and they got on quite well together. However, there was some sign of tensions. For example, Stalin was quite frustrated about the delay that the West were taking in starting this second front, this D-Day, which came in 1944, and unbeknownst at the time that Stalin had most of the hotel rooms at this conference bugged, wired for sound, because he didn't trust what the Allies, what kind of their true intentions were. Arguably that's quite well founded, but at the time it's definitely a sign of the mistrust that was going on. Okay, so the next time that they meet is at Yalta in the Crimea in February 1943. By now, the Second World War is entering its final phases. The Second Front had opened in D-Day in 1944. And so what we see here is the main discussions about what was going to happen to Germany at the end of the Second World War. By now Franklin Roosevelt was gravely ill. He had only weeks left to live, but it's still Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin that meet at this conference. Again, unconditional surrender is guaranteed, and the Soviet Union also guaranteed that 3 months after the surrender of Nazi Germany, they would declare war on Japan and contribute to the defeat of Japan in the East as well. Stalin again holds firm to the fact that there will be free and democratic elections in Poland. It's also agreed at the Yalta Conference that Germany will be divided into zones of occupation, because it was anticipated in February 1945 that the Red Army and the Allies advancing from the west and the Red Army in the east would meet somewhere probably midway through Germany. It was agreed at Yalta that the Red Army would capture Berlin, but that there would be zones of occupation. Principally the British zones would be in the northwestern region of Germany, the Americans would be in the southwest, and that there would be a Soviet zone of occupation in the eastern sector. Stalin also demanded that there would be reparations, that is payment for war damages, from Germany, and that the city of Berlin, which lay 70 or 80 miles deep inside the Soviet zone, would also be split into zones of occupation. We have the British, the Americans and the Russians, and not forgetting the French, because there were French sectors as well, although they were significantly smaller. That's quite important to understand, that so these zones of occupation would take place. There'd also be a war crimes tribunal set up at the end of the war to hold the Nazi leaders accountable for the atrocities that were committed during the Second World War. So again, the mood is quite good, and all seems well. What changes is at the Potsdam Conference, because by Potsdam, Roosevelt has died, and we have a new American president, Harry Truman. A very different person. Roosevelt tended to get on quite well with Stalin, but at the Potsdam Conference we see tensions rising personally between Truman and Stalin, because the war's now over. This is July 1945, the final Potsdam Conference. And what you need to know at the Potsdam Conference is that there seems to be some disagreement about what the Soviet intentions are in Eastern Europe, because although Stalin did agree to elections, things start going awry. Politicians are going missing. Stalin is delaying on certain issues. So the mood is different at Potsdam. Nothing else is really agreed on firmly. It's just really more the same what was agreed at Yalta. What is different is the mood. One thing that's worth mentioning about the Potsdam Conference is that by July 1945, America have detonated their first atomic bomb in America, in the Nevada desert, and Truman tells Stalin that he intends to use it against Japan. So we begin now to see that there is a kind of a new rivalry beginning to take place in the international setting, that it's not now about how we kind of settle with the old scores with Germany, it's how these two great superpowers are going to work alongside each other. America agreed that there would be a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and likewise that the American would have a sphere of influence within Western Europe as well. Okay, so what happens after the conferences? Things start deteriorating quite quickly. In 1945-46 we see a war of words between the two superpowers, beginning with the long telegram. George Kennan, the ambassador to Moscow, the State Department, was asked his assessment of Soviet intentions in the post-war world, and he sent a very long telegram stating that the Russian intentions are that they see the security of Eastern Europe as a paramount factor, that the threat of invasion that had taken place in the previous years through the Civil War, and the German invasion in the First World War and in the Second World War, meant that they will go to extreme measures to ensure that that kind of thing doesn't happen again. This telegram also stated that the Russians are a very, very aggressive nation, and they respond to hardline force if need be, but they will back down if the force is legitimate and threatening enough. There was similarly, Stalin got a telegram from his foreign office in Washington, the Novikov telegram, back to Stalin, and in this telegram you pretty much get the impression that America is intent on world domination through the use of capitalism, and that they intend to spread their influence and that this poses a grave threat to the security of the USSR, because the spread of capitalism, of course, in Europe poses great problems to the communist regime in the Soviet Union. And so immediately we're getting expert opinions from either side, creating this kind of dangerous perception about the intentions of each other. This is not helped in March 1946, when the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill goes to Fulton, Missouri, and delivers a lecture warning that an iron curtain is now descending across Europe, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. That's what he says. Names two very important cities in in Central Europe, whereby within one sphere you've got the Western influence, and you have across this other iron curtain the Soviet sphere, behind which lie the great countries of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. That immediately, because of his audience, to an American audience, Churchill speaking to the American people, is listened to by the Soviets, and that invokes a fierce response from Stalin, criticising Churchill for doing so. So we begin to see now this entrenchment, these two camps beginning to kind of be critical of each other openly. Things move at a pace. In 1947-48, Britain announces that they can no longer afford to maintain their commitments in Europe because of domestic problems in the aftermath of the Second World War, which we look at in Unit 3, of course, with Britain. And they announce that they will be moving away from, they'll be withdrawing troops from Greece within 8 weeks. And at that time Britain was involved in a civil war in Greece, trying to keep the peace between the communists and the nationalists fighting in Greece. And this sends alarm bells in America, and it ushers in the creation of the European Recovery Programme, or Marshall Aid, where the US Secretary of State George C. Marshall announces let's get the statistics right, $13 billion rescue plan, mainly in the form of US grants, but also through equipment, plant hire, livestock, machinery, that would essentially rescue Europe from communism, because at that time, by 1947, Europe is struggling to get back on its feet economically in the aftermath of the Second World War. The Marshall Aid is the best example of what was to become known as the Truman Doctrine, and what Truman wanted to achieve through activities such as the Marshall Plan is to stop the spread of communism in its tracks. He called this containment. And the idea is that if we can support economically nations that might be about to turn communist, through communist revolution, insurgency, by giving people jobs, by giving them food, by giving them money, they would be able to make the economies of these countries grow and therefore stop communist revolutions taking place. And it was extremely successful. A good example, of course, is Greece, but of course the biggest recipient of Marshall Aid was Great Britain, which was seen as a major actor in the European recovery, and that if Britain struggled economically, if you used Britain to kind of bolster support in Europe, so much the better. So the Marshall Plan was extremely successful. Don't forget, as I speak to you, you can use the textbook to mete out any of this story as we go. So very quickly you can see that the Soviet Union would feel quite threatened by this Marshall Aid, and that they reject, and Stalin virtually demands that the countries within their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe refuse Marshall Aid. With the one exception is that Yugoslavia, under the Marshal Tito, accepts Marshall Aid, and immediately Stalin expels him from the Soviet sphere of influence. And so good on you, Tito, and good on you, Yugoslavia. They were doing their own thing. They remained communist for the rest of the Cold War, but they were outside the Soviet sphere. And they could do this because the Red Army didn't liberate East Yugoslavia. The Yugoslavians themselves rose up against the Germans at the end of the Second World War, and they set up their own government. But in the rest of Eastern Europe, this moves into our next chapter, is that it's very easier for the Soviet Union in the years after the Second World War to establish satellite states. Why? Because the Red Army were physically in these places, so the Red Army could control things. Secondly, Stalin could put people that he trusted in positions of power. And thirdly, he can use fear and intimidation to weed out opposition units. So by the end of the 1940s, pretty much all of Eastern Europe is under Soviet control, influence, I should say, not control, not direct control, because there are Hungarians, communists running Hungary, there are East Germans running East Germany, but they are definitely, before they do anything significant, they have to get on the phone to Moscow to check with Uncle Joe Stalin that everything's okay there with them. So, Marshall Aid, Soviet influence growing in Eastern Europe. The next flashpoint in the Cold War would be the Berlin blockade. So, leading up to the Berlin blockade, Stalin's response to the Marshall Aid was to create Cominform, which is the Communist Information Bureau, an organisation set up to spread the sphere of influence and spread communism around the world in 1947. And his response to Marshall Aid is to create Comintern, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, in 1949, and that aids. That pretty much echoes what the Marshall Aid is trying to do in Western Europe. Comintern does the same in Eastern Europe. What we see in 1948 is the creation of Trizonia, well, firstly Bizonia, where the western zones of Britain and America are combined to create one zone. So we've got currency flowing between the two states, these two zones. It's also an acknowledgement now that Britain and America are working very closely together. The French join Bizonia to create Trizonia. So if you look at a map of this emerging Germany in the late 1940s, you've got Trizonia in the west, and you've got a Eastern Soviet zone in the east of Germany, and then you've got Berlin. Now Stalin wants the Allies to leave Berlin, so what he does in 1948 is that he blockades Germany. He refuses access to the rail, the road, and the sea links into Berlin, with the view that he's trying to get the Allies to leave Berlin and leave the whole of Eastern Germany under Soviet control. The Western response is the Berlin airlift. So what we see for nearly a year is a concerted effort by the West to fly in food supplies into Western Berlin to ensure that it doesn't starve. And because all the while Stalin is saying, well, we can supply the western side of Berlin, just if you guys leave, we'll take over. But they don't. The Allies are determined to stay. And this is the first time where potentially there could have been an armed conflict between the two sides, because at any time the Russians could have shot down supply planes flying into Western Berlin, but they don't. So the Berlin airlift lasts until 1949. It ends, and what we see in 1949 is the creation of a West Germany, a Federal Republic of Germany that is democratic, that is aligned to America and Britain. And the Soviets respond by creating a German Democratic Republic, or an East Germany, that is aligned to the Soviet Union. And so things are beginning to definitely split in two now. Two Germanys, two superpowers, and Berlin is at the heart of this because we have this divided city there in 1949. The West then create a military alliance in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty, NATO, whereby most of the countries of Western Europe and the North Atlantic sphere, including Canada, sign up to an agreement of mutual assurance of collective security, that if any country is invaded, all the other countries will come to its aid. That's 1949. The Soviets respond to that. By 1955, we get the creation of the Warsaw Pact, which is another military alliance set up to counter the threat from NATO. So there's our first introduction to the origins of the Cold War. Begins with Allies working together against the Germans. The splits begin to show in the conferences. We get a war of words, and then the Truman Doctrine really does speed things up with the Marshall Aid. That leads to the creation of Trizonia, leads to the Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift, and then by the end of the 40s, you've got these alliances, there's NATO and Warsaw Pact. So in a nutshell, you possibly will get questions asking you to describe the key features of any of those. You could be asked to look at documentary evidence to describe how useful evidence is. It could be some examples of telegrams. How useful is this telegram for understanding how relations deteriorated in the years 1945 to 51? Or you might get a more wider, longer question: how did relationships develop between 1945 and 51? So I hope that first initial podcast was helpful. The next podcast will look at the Hungarian, the Czech, Prague Spring, Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Berlin Crisis, as 4 examples of how the Cold War developed in the years in the 1950s to the 1960s. Okay, I will now upload this file for you. Hope it's helpful.